EURORDIS. I've been working for EURORDIS since 2003, where I joined after 13 years of being an advocate in a completely different domain, AIDS and HIV, both at the national level and then European level and then international level on access issues all over the world to the newly authorized anti-HIV treatments. And I think my experience in HIV and AIDS is extremely helpful to all the many diseases in rare diseases where we are struggling to boost research and development of medicines. So when I came here, I looked into a presentation that we have at EURORDIS that explains all what we do, and it's more than 80 slides, I think, so it's impossible in 30 minutes to summarize all what we do. I know Russell expects that I would say a few words about the European reference networks, which is not my best expertise. So probably next year you may invite someone else. I would prefer to focus on the subjects that I know the best. And patients making a difference, I will start by telling you 5 stories, a few from HIV and AIDS, but others from rare diseases. First, I don't know how many of you ever heard about EURORDIS, a pharmaceutical company called EURORDIS. It's a dwarf company. I'm not even sure it still exists, but it's a company which started to develop products for HIV in the 90s, and it was struggling to succeed in developing new medicines, competing with very large pharmas like Abbott, MSD, Roche, Glaxo Wellcome. And this company was also very special because amongst shareholders and among the senior management and the board of directors of that company, you had people with AIDS and HIV. And then the relations between the patient community and the company was a very special one. And they invited patients to one of these community advisory boards, which I will explain in a minute what they are. In '95, they were developing a very promising new product. They had a meeting with clinicians. They wanted to have the backup of the decision from the physicians with which dose of the product should we continue the development. The product they had was even more powerful, more potent than all the other ones which appeared on the market in '96 and which really changed the course of HIV. So the clinicians, they all wanted immediately to test the highest possible dose, which was the highest, with the highest potency. So they invited patients to a community advisory board. So we were there, 20 of us from all over the world, well, US and Europe. We looked at the data, we listened to their explanation, and they wanted us to confirm the dose selected by clinicians. And the dose was quite safe, not the serious adverse events that we could see with other products, not the famous grade 3 or grade 4 adverse events. But then I asked a question regarding a grade 2 adverse event. A grade 2 typically is a mild side effect. You're never hospitalized. You don't die of these grade 2 side effects. But there was one of them which affected 20% of the patients in the early clinical trials. So I simply asked what it was. And so the description by the company was not clear. The side effect was loose stools. And we had quite a long discussions to understand what it was exactly. Not exactly diarrhea. You don't need to take treatment to correct this. But then it appeared that thinking of the patient population, the target population, their clients, those who were supposed to use that product, to have loose stools would make their sexual life become miserable. And we advised them, this is not the right dose. If that's the side effect that you will induce in this population, then patients will stop taking your product. We had difficulties convincing them, but at the end of the day, the deal was to introduce a new arm in the clinical trial to compare the dose that the patients were proposing against the dose that the clinicians had proposed before. And we won, because the authorized dose is the dose that patients had insisted the company would test. And of course, 2 years later, when the product was authorized, the CEO of the company told us, well, you know, this is our best case scenario for the sales and the profit the company made with that product. And according to their best case scenarios, after 2 years on the market, they made $500 million profits, more than their best case scenario, simply because patients were staying on the treatment much longer than the company had estimated in the base case. Simply by inviting patients to a meeting which cost them 50,000 euros, they made $500 million more benefits than estimated in their best case scenarios, because they listened to the patients and they disclosed all the information that they had. The second story, and this happened last week in Zurich on Saturday, where the Cystic Fibrosis Europe community network organized a second meeting of their newly established Community Advisory Board. It's a very specific rare disease. First, it's one of the most frequent. And you may have heard about the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the US, which donated $150 million to a company called Vertex to develop a product that targets 6% of the cystic fibrosis population. And the product is on the market. It's very expensive. Vertex makes a lot of money with it. And the deal between the two was that Vertex would pay back to the foundation according to the sales, to the amount of the sales. And in fact, they gave back to the foundation $3 billion. And the foundation is now reinvesting all these dollars in other developments. So now in cystic fibrosis, they have 24 products in development, in research and development. It's rare to have that many products in a rare disease, but that's the challenge that the cystic fibrosis community is facing. They have 24 products in development, and there is a group of 12 volunteers which want to advise each one of the companies developing the most promising products to ensure the development goes well and the clinical trials which are conducted have high chances of the development to continue to the end. Novartis is one of the other competitors to Vertex. They met also with the patient community for a completely different type of discussion, more a strategy discussion. Since Vertex has now invaded the market, Novartis had invested a lot of money in other products, and they want now to step down. So they met with the patients community to discuss any possibility patients could think of to rescue the products that Novartis had, or to have the understanding by the patients community of the reasons why Novartis would step down. Another example is Karen Ayash, the mother of a girl called Ornella. When Ornella was born, she was immediately diagnosed with a mucopolysaccharidosis, Sanfilippo syndrome. And Karen started to look for some information about this disease, and she joined EURORDIS. She came to us, and then she participated to the summer school in Barcelona that we run every year to train patients on regulatory affairs, what it means to develop a medicine, what role patients can play in the development and evaluation of medicines. So she learned a lot. She then joined the Committee of Advanced Therapies at the EMA, where she could meet experts of advanced medicine therapies like gene therapy, stem cell therapies, etc. And she ordered an audit. That was what she used to do as a profession. She audits companies to recommend buying or selling shares of the companies. So she made an audit with a young neurobiologist of the situation with the disease. How many researchers, which teams, which resources, which products are being developed, which similar products in similar diseases have been developed and by whom. And then she created an online community where she could contact 50 families. That was the largest family network with San Filippo at that time. They first thought of creating a foundation that would fund research, and then hoping that someone would have an idea. And discussing with experts of the Committee of Advanced Therapies at the EMA, she thought, well, maybe instead of injecting an enzyme, which is a large molecule, directly into the brain of our children to prevent the disease progression, and the disease progresses very fast. After 2 years after birth, the brain starts to be so destroyed that the babies, the children, lose all their cognitive functions. So she knew she had just 2 years to find something. So discussing with these experts, they thought rather than injecting an enzyme in the brain of the children, a gene therapy may be the solution. And then they thought, okay, but if we create a foundation, it will take forever. They created their own pharmaceutical company, Disogen, which ran the first gene therapy clinical trial on their own children. And now they are looking for other industrial partners to continue the development. And this created for the first time some interest about San Filippo, and now they are facing a new situation where 3 other companies or initiatives are developing competing products to this gene therapy trial, and now there are not enough children in the world for the 4 developments to be run in parallel. So the parent community is divided between different projects, but it's the problem of the rich. When you don't have product in development, you don't have that situation. And I think that's one of the excellent initiatives, like Nick explained, where patients take it on board. She's an entrepreneur by profession, so for her it was natural to act this way and to propose to other parents to launch this pharmaceutical company. The last example is Thibotech. Thibotech doesn't exist anymore. It was acquired by, I think, Johnson & Johnson. And Thibotech was the last company to invest in HIV when already many products were there. And the company immediately realized that the only way they could have an advantage over their competitors was to work with the patients. And they worked with the patients with a lot of intelligence. They were very smart. They talked about everything. The patients told them how to design the clinical trials, which comparator, which duration, which kind of design could work. And they even discussed the fair pricing policy. And the company realized that the patients were not really trained. They didn't have really the knowledge in health economics to discuss fair pricing. So instead of continuing the discussion, the company made a grant education donation to the patient community so that they could participate to some trainings like at the London School of Economics, where they were trained about fair pricing issues and discussions. And after 6 months, they reconvened, and then they could discuss fair pricing on a more balanced level of discussion because the patients had been trained about these complex issues. And the company made it. All products they were developing, they all made it to the market, and they are still very largely used to treat HIV. And all these thanks to the excellent discussion they had with the patient community, so that now it's a standard operating procedure in the company. It's mandatory for all those who are responsible for the development of a treatment in the company. At each milestone, at each important step of the development, they have to discuss, is it the right time to discuss with patients and about what before we go to the next step. If they fail to meet with patients to discuss the next step, then they breach the policy of the company. The last thing is that a few years ago, a member of a task force that we have at EURORDIS working on the development and regulation of medicines called us. She had a cousin in Romania who was suffering from multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and his doctor was looking for a new product to help construct a more robust regimen to control the tuberculosis. And they heard there was a product in development. So she called us at EURORDIS asking, can we have access to products which are not yet fully developed? Of course, that's called compassionate use, and we have a long experience with compassionate use since it was invented by treatment activists in the 80s and 90s, first in the US and then in Europe. We looked, there were trials in progress in Europe, in Latvia and in Estonia, so that was the prerequisite to have a compassionate use. You have to have clinical trials in progress. And then I realized that the developer was Thibotec. So I contacted Thibotec. They say, OK. I said, can you write a letter? And they sent immediately the letter where they were accepting to provide as much product as needed to Romania on a free basis for all patients in need. And we sent the letter to the Ministry of Health in Romania. It took quite some while before the patients could receive the treatment. The first patient, the cousin of Etelka, died, unfortunately, because it took too long to launch the program. But then all of the patients with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis in Romania, and including 2 healthcare professionals who had also been infected, could receive the treatment, not as a clinical trial, but as a compassionate use between this period where clinical trials are in progress, but the product is not yet authorized because not all results are there. We could talk for hours about compassionate use. This is really something that is extremely important to discuss with the developers early, to anticipate the moment where the company knows that there is enough to think that the product has high chances to make it to the market. Inevitably, patients who are not in the clinical trial may ask the company, okay, what about me? When can I access? I don't have the time to wait for the end of the development. Can we think of a program where patients in great need of the product can receive it on a compassionate basis? I will mention a few programs, a few activities that we have in EURORDIS to really make sure that we all share the experiences that we have from all these developments, so that all groups that are willing to act and to have an active role in development of medicines can do so. So briefly, rare diseases, as you certainly know, affect fewer than 1 person among 2,000. So the maximum on the EU population would represent 230,000 patients for 1 rare disease. More than that, it's not a rare disease. There are more than 6,000 rare diseases, but 1,200 represent more than 5 cases. There is a large number of rare diseases for which only 5 cases have been published in the scientific literature. We estimate that 3 to 6% of the population is affected or will be affected at some point in their life by a rare disease, of which many, but not all, are of genetic origin. Some may have some genes involved, but they haven't been discovered yet, and there are other factors. There are environmental factors. Here, I just mentioned a case that was brought to our attention by the Progressive Supranuclear Palsy Patient Organization in France, because they realized that in their members list, the group is largely dominated by patients from a town called Waterloo in the north of France. And epidemiologists think that maybe it's not transmitted by the genes, but near Waterloo there is a garbage dump. There was a factory from Eugene Kuhlmann producing aluminium, and now there is this garbage dump made of phosphogyps, which is not a natural product. And every time it rains, phosphogyps goes to the canal, and there are many people living along the canal where they grow their vegetables, etc. And it may be that there is something inherited, but there may be also something from the environment that explains the peak of prevalence of the disease in this town. The problem is that this type of research are extremely complex and extremely expensive to do, and there are not enough of them. It's difficult to describe, but this is the distribution of rare diseases according to their prevalence. There are very few rare diseases with high numbers of patients. On the graph, the maximum definition of a rare disease would be around 50 for 100,000 patients. And there are just one or two diseases from time to time which have high numbers of patients. The vast majority of rare diseases are more in the range of LHON rare disease, with 1 out of 100,000 persons that has the rare disease. And that was really the problem to motivate industry to invest in rare diseases. What would be the return on investments in diseases with so few patients? And for this, EURORDIS was created in 1997 to create a favorable economic environment to encourage industry to invest in rare diseases, gaining, for example, 10 years market exclusivity for companies who succeed in marketing a product for a rare disease with other financial advantages. As we speak, since the regulation was adopted in 2000, there are 143 products which receive the orphan drug designation. That means specifically developed for rare diseases, which are authorized. By the end of 2020, there should be 200 in total. So it's a progress. And there are pharmaceutical companies which were created only with the objective of developing treatments for rare diseases, which is a consequence of the adoption of this regulation, because they know, they understand that there are scientific supports, there is financial support for them to take the risk to invest in diseases where it is more difficult to have returns on investments. EURORDIS in brief, so we were founded in 1997 to support the adoption of the regulation on orphan medicinal products. As we speak, we have 761 members in about 68 countries. We have national alliances, like Rare Diseases UK is one, which gather all patient organizations in rare diseases in one country. And we also have disease-specific federations, like the European Federation of Hemophilia Patients, which gather all national groups for hemophilia. And we have 58 such specific networks. There will be a meeting end of October in Paris with some training for these networks. But we are also in contact with almost 2,000 other patient organizations. We estimate that EURORDIS represents maybe 4,000 distinct rare diseases. And our role is to understand the needs of all these very different, very heterogeneous diseases and find common solutions. We are based in Paris, Brussels, Barcelona, Geneva, London, and Zagreb, and we have a bit more than 40 staff members. It is one of the largest patient networks in Europe, and we have also many volunteers. So before coming here, I looked at some information for your disease, LHON. Who's actively developing medicines for this disease? So the main sources of information that we use is the European Register of Pharmaceuticals, where all companies which obtain an orphan drug designation for the products they develop have to list their products. We are listed in this register. So there are 2 products for LHON, Raxone, which is already authorized, and the gene therapy by Gencyte. But there are other products on Orphanet, listing one which is alpha-tocotrienolquinone, which is designated in Europe for Lee syndrome and in the US for mitochondrial membrane transport disorders. So there may be other sources getting some ideas on on other products of interest to you. Regarding clinical trials, the European Register of Clinical Trial lists 8 studies, 8 clinical trials in progress or completed for LHON. But looking at the US equivalent by the NIH, there are 23 clinical trials completed or in progress for LHON. And it also gives you the names of the developers, the company or the public. Here it's only the private companies, but there are also the NIH conducting some research, which I'm sure some of you are aware. So it's not only for medicines, but there are some medical devices in development to stimulate the growth of the nerves, or which were in development, but I understand they stopped. They have to do some work again on it. A medical device to stimulate the growth of the optic nerve. So what can you do? It's not my last slide, but I think I will stop after this one because there are many, many things that other groups have done that you have been doing already, but this is a more general picture of the chronology of all the many activities that you can do to accelerate and accompany the development of medicines or medical devices. It starts with some training, and there are many resources available online or in face-to-face meeting, like the summer school that we organize every year in Barcelona. It's a 5-day training where you can meet other patients who are actively involved in the regulation or development of medicines, and you can also meet the members of scientific committees at the European Medicines Agency who explain how they work and how they involve patients in their activities. Last year at the European Medicines Agency, 745 occasions, patients were invited to one of the discussions at the agency about the marketing of a new product or the withdrawal of some products. And this agency is really largely involving patients in their activities, and also in scientific advice or reviewing the information for patients. When the committee that approves new medicines is hesitating, they call for a meeting with the company, and since 2014, they always invite patients, at least, well, 2 patients, at least for the patients to understand the reasoning behind the rejection of a product. And often, the participation of the patient can change, in fact, the decision that the agency was prepared to make. So it starts with training. Another very important activity and action, particularly for these diseases where there is little experience in the pharmaceutical companies and little success in developing medicines, it is extremely important to work with the regulators on these guidelines. It's a document from the regulators that tells to the companies, this is how you should develop medicines for this disease. I won't click here, but there is an example. There was a workshop on vision loss, not the type of vision loss that you have with LHON, but all the other eye diseases, a high-level scientific workshop with patients, clinicians, researchers, companies, and regulators. A one-day workshop where they defined all that companies could be looking at when developing a medicine to show the effect of the medicine in the eye for the vision, so that the regulators would be confident in using the results of the clinical trials. And there is no such guidelines for LHON, but I think this would really be the first step. Regulators themselves have difficulties in analyzing the results that some companies produce, and we need to teach the regulators on this important information. Fund research, participate to joint ventures. There are 34 patient organizations at present which have signed a joint venture agreement with a company to participate to the development. Control your conflicts of interest and be aware of other influences. That's important because you can work with a company to accompany the development of a medicine. But then it may put limits to the capacity the European Medicine Agency or others when they want to consult you. If you have been working too closely with a company, then there may be problems in being consulted by these agencies. So it's important to share information and to discuss how to do it the right way. Horizon scanning, that is to have an eye on all the products, all the developments which are coming. It's important. Of course, you can work with a specialist, with clinicians, but there are diseases where some experts have their own thoughts, their own preferences for some products. It's important to list yourself all the development, all the research in progress. Sometimes if you rely on 1, 2, 3 experts, you may miss some developments which to them may not be that important, not priority, but it's still worth having a look on everything. Advise developers of products, health technologies, and again, it's not only medicines, it can be medical devices or connected devices or wearables, creating community advisory boards, negotiate compassionate use programs, elicit preferences between different treatment options. When you have different treatment options, there are new techniques to listen to the preferences of patients when there is a new product in development compared to the existing treatments. What would you like this new product to change in your life? And these techniques help the developers making the right investments in the right products that can really, at the end of the development, change the course of the disease. Give your opinion on the benefit risk. That's for the marketing authorization. If you are well trained and if you are ready, you may be consulted by the EMA. They will invite 1, 2, 3 of you to discuss with them what you think about the new product. Have a close watch on the medicine once it is authorized. That's pharmacovigilance. It's extremely important, particularly for rare diseases where the number of patients in clinical trials by definition is limited. It's only when the product is on the market that we start learning things which we haven't seen in the clinical trials, and that's called pharmacovigilance. Compare access to care in different countries. Not all products are available in all countries at the same time when they are authorized, and that's something extremely useful to do, to compare the access in different countries and discuss with European and national authorities how to improve access. Discuss fair pricing with authorities and developer. Provide your views on reimbursement and coverage decisions. So that's the kind of activity that, for example, NICE does in the UK, but now there is a European cooperation of grouping all agencies like NICE or HAS in France that recommend a product, a medicine for reimbursement. We may, before the end of this year, have a legislative proposal from the European Commission to create a European agency for this kind of recommendations after the marketing authorization, and we are pushing for these. And to finish, conduct patient therapeutic education programs. These are programs for disease where it is extremely important to educate the patients. It's true for diabetes, for multiple sclerosis, when you have complex treatments and many things to do, test your blood, etc. These therapeutic education programs are there to make sure that the treatments are followed as they should be. And I will stop here because it's time, and I think thank you.
I'm not even going to ask for questions at this point because we're ready to go for lunch now. If anyone has burning questions, then have a word with me, and we'll perhaps ask Francois to just say a few words when we come back from the break. As you can see from all of this, I think, bearing in mind that I've probably got a dozen questions for every bubble that's on that slide, you start to understand why I never know anything about Francois, because all of these things are on my list every time we meet, and I never get to the bottom of that list, and I suspect I never will. But I'd like to thank Francois for coming to speak to us. One thing I should say is that a lot of the discussion this morning has been a bit complicated. Some of you may have struggled to follow it. I have myself at times. But we will be hopefully posting all of this on the website when we get it available as a video. So you can actually go back and think, what was it he said there? And you can actually see some of these things again. Ask us if you have questions. We'll relay them. This doesn't end with today's conference. This is the beginning, not the end of this discussion. So thank you, Francois.